Hi, everyone. Welcome to Pittsburgh Sports Memories. I'm Tim Hannon.
And I'm Steve Wirt.
And this is the podcast where we look back at some of the fun moments in the history of Pittsburgh sports. This episode we've entitled The B Team. And what we're going to do this episode, Pittsburgh sports, like a lot of other towns' sports histories, is full of the all-time greats. You have your Joe Greens and Sidney Crosbys and Roberto Clementes. But then, a lot of the success that a lot of our teams have had has been due to maybe some lesser known players, but well-liked players. So in this episode, we're going to try to go through a list, and we didn't rank them. We're just kind of going to go and pick some of our favorites, but some of our favorite kind of lesser known guys. Hopefully, some of your favorite lesser known guys too, and guys that really left a mark on Pittsburgh sports history. We tried to come up with a criteria for this, like, they couldn't have ever been elected to an all-star game or something to that effect, but that was a little too difficult. So this is a little subjective. So you might disagree with some of these guys. You might say, oh, he was better than a B team guy, but this is our list. So let us know on our website, pittsburghsportsmemories.weebly.com, who we left off and who you disagree with. But anyway, with that intro, let's get into some of our guys, and I'll kick us off. My first lesser known guy is Robert Lang. Robert Lang was a winger for the Penguins in the late 90s or early 2000s. And early in his Penguins career, he was a guy that was super frustrating to watch. They had played him on a line with Jaromir Jagr, and he was literally afraid to shoot the puck. He played with Jagr, and he would just try to force pass to Jagr all the time, and it was infuriating. And when Mario Lemieux returned, the Penguins had this second line. It had Alexei Kovalev, Martin Straka, and they put Robert Lang on that line. And Robert Lang really flourished on that line, really kind of hit his stride. Became a pretty productive player for the Penguins. Still not a superstar, but pretty productive. And one story I always remember about Robert Lang was I was in a Dick's Sporting Goods, and there was a guy sitting at a table to sign autographs, and he was just sitting by himself at this table, and it was Robert Lang. And I just always felt bad. Poor Robert Lang was just sitting there by himself, hoping that somebody would come up and want his autograph. But, again, productive player.
I remember he couldn't hit, the net at all. Maybe that's why I didn't shoot. I just remember one time I went to a game, and, he's, shooting at the net, and the puck literally went into the far corner. It's how do you even do that? And it didn't deflect off anything. It just, literally went into it's I've seen street hockey players with better shots than that. It was pretty ugly. His shot was pretty ugly. Probably why he didn't shoot. So I guess we're on to the next person. Would be my choice, which would be Ernie Mills. I remember people used to have a nickname, Ernie No Skills Mills, but I always liked Ernie Mills, and that was one of the early Steelers that I really liked because the Steelers had this other guy, Jeff Graham, who would be open but would drop every pass every time. He couldn't catch anything. And then you had Ernie Mills, who seemed like he was covered and he would catch everything. So it was he was the anti-Jeff Graham, and I could live with that. I'd rather you catch the ball and not be open than be wide open, and you're just useless at that point. But he did, a good point. He made a big catch in the AFC Championship game. He did end up getting hurt in Super Bowl 30, and he left, and he had a pretty decent year in Carolina, I think Dallas eventually. But I would call him definitely a solid B-teamer because he was never, who was the big receivers on that team? Thigpen or Hastings, even Cordell. But he was definitely one of those guys that he ended up being like a really solid NFL player. You know, he's not going to the Hall of Fame, probably not going to make the Pro Bowl, but without him, he definitely we don't go to the Super Bowl that year.
Yeah, he breaks up a pass in the championship game that was going to be the game-clinching interception, and then he catches the pass in the championship game. That was in 1995. We did an episode about that. Go back and listen if you haven't. But you're right. We don't make the Super Bowl that year if not for Ernie Mills. The next guy on our list is Gary Jones. Gary Jones was a defensive back for the Steelers in the early 90s. Wasn't real great at coverage. Never really was a starter, kind of one of those dime and nickel players. But the thing everybody always remembers about Gary Jones is he was just maybe the hardest hitter in the history of the team. There's a famous hit on Don Beebe, who was a wide receiver for the Buffalo Bills on a Monday night game, where he just destroyed Don Beebe. And there was lots of Gary Jones highlights like that. He just, if you came over the middle against Gary Jones, he was going to destroy you. And I think that endeared him to a lot of Pittsburgh fans, you know, who like the blue collar, steel curtain, toughness kind of defense. Gary Jones was never a real significant contributor, but man, could he hit.
And they probably ended up changing some rules there eventually because of Gary Jones and hitting people like that. Don Beebe still might not remember who he is. Gary Jones, I don't know how good of a coverage, but boy, he could hit. He could certainly hit. And it was mainly that Monday night game. I don't remember too many other hits though. Maybe it was just kind of that one he was at.
He destroyed Andre Reed one time. That was a different Buffalo game. I mean, there was a couple of just big hits he had. But man, he was just like you said. I don't think he could play today. You can't really do that anymore.
Yeah. The next up is I don't know if anybody remember this outside of me, but this is more like a childhood hero. After Willie Stargell retired, who was like my favorite Pirate growing up, there was this guy Mike Diaz, and he was a power hitting first baseman / catcher from 86 to 88. His nickname at the time, because he kind of looked like Rambo, and he would just like hit home runs and like kind of look like Rambo. And I was like in third grade and thought Rambo was cool. So, you know, the Pirates have this guy Rambo, and he's gonna, draw first blood against the pitcher or something. I don't know. He messed up his thumb, I remember, and like he was never quite the same hitter. And I remember like he got like they traded him or cut him, and he went to the White Sox and got picked off like multiple times in one game, and it was like his career was over. But I was doing some research for this, and apparently he played in Japan for like 4 more years. So good for Mike Diaz. Definitely a B team guy. He was on some really. It's too bad he left before the Pirates got good. He was kind of like that post drug era Pirates when they weren't really good at all. I don't know do you remember Mike Diaz, Tim?
Very vaguely, yeah. I mean, like you said, that was not an era that you remember a lot of Pirates. That was when they were just starting to come out of the fog. But man, that's a pretty cool nickname.
Rambo.
Next guy on the list is Ron Tugnut. Ron Tugnut was an NHL goaltender who the Penguins traded for late in the 2000 season. At this point in his career, he was a journeyman goaltender. He played for 5 different teams. And the Penguins picked him up at the very end of the season. He only played in 7 regular season games. So they kind of picked him up as a veteran backup going into the playoffs, but he ends up being their starter in the playoffs, and he gets really hot. The first round they play the Washington Capitals, and in the first 2 games of that series, Tugnut only gives up 1 goal in the first 2 games combined. And then in the second round, they play the Flyers, and he does the exact same thing. In the first 2 games, he only gives up 1 goal. And, for a while, Ron Tugnut, there's a lot of instances in NHL history where a team is decent, but a goaltender kind of gets them over the hump and into the Stanley Cup Finals. And for a while, you thought maybe that was going to be the 2000 Penguins. Unfortunately, in that Flyers series, they lose Game 3 in overtime, and then in Game 4, Tugnut makes 70 saves in Game 4. but they lose the game in the 5th overtime. Keith Primeau finally beat him in the 5th overtime at like 2:30 in the morning. The Flyers go on to win that series, and that kind of is the end of Tugnut's time in Pittsburgh. But, memorable that he had that hot streak and that he was the goalie that made 70 saves in a game that went into 5 overtimes.
Well, his nickname was Ron Tough Luck, because he always seemed to have like bad things go against him. So poor Ron Tugnut, I guess he was more unlucky than good, and especially in like overtime in the playoffs. Like Keith Primeau, really. I mean, that guy's, it's always somebody weird scores, and it's never the superstars, it seems.
And after 5 over, that's literally your 8th period of hockey at that point.
You've played a whole other game.
Yeah, you're on your 3rd. You're in the middle of your 3rd consecutive game at that point. I think it was just somebody was just destined to put one by one of the 2 goaltenders, and it just happened to be Primeau and Tugnut. Unfortunately, like you said, tough luck.
That's I guess he earned his nickname that day. Next up on the list is a Pitt running back kick returner, Laurod Stevens-Howling. He was a very small running back. He was listed at 5'7", but having seen him in person, if he was an inch above 5'3", that was probably being generous. When he first came to Pitt, he was just a guy with a bunch of speed that could like return kicks. But as he went through, he's one of those guys that like really developed into like a complete player. He was at the end there, he was a better all-around running back than LeSean McCoy, because he could play third downs. And even at his small size, he knew how to pick up a blitz or when to go out in the pass pattern. And boy, that really served him well. He went on to the NFL for a 4-year career. And I think he really maximized. You see guys that sometimes waste their opportunity, who have all the talent in the world. I think this guy got every last thing out of his talent and physical ability that he could get, and that's always it's easy to root for a Laurod Stevens-Howling. He did play the Steelers one preseason before he tore his ACL, and then that was kind of the end of him. But
versatile guy, could return kicks, just played above his pay grade, which I think a lot of the guys on this list, I think that's what endeared them to Pittsburgh fans, was just them kind of playing above their pay grade.
Yeah, he fit in well in Arizona. That's when like Arizona would like take anybody from Pittsburgh. It was like Pittsburgh.
Yeah. Yes. Next guy on the list is Justin Strelzyk. His nickname was Jugs. He was a big utility man on the offensive line for the Steelers. Actually played here for 10 seasons, and they kind of moved him around. They used him in different positions. And he was just a guy. He had this big, huge beard. He always looked like a guy that you would see in a biker bar. Myron Cope used to, if you ever listened to the Myron Cope postgame back then, he would always say he was trying to bum cigarettes off of Justin Strelzyk before he came on the air on the postgame in the locker room. So that was just kind of Justin Strelzyk's demeanor, biker guy that smokes cigarettes. Sadly, if you ever seen the Will Smith movie, Justin Strelzyk's one of the people portrayed in that movie, the concussion movie. And Strelzyk suffered from CTE after his career and started engaging in some bizarre behavior, ended up leading the police on a wild police chase, and ended up crashing his car and being killed in 2004. So very sad end to his life and career, but was kind of a memorable player when he was here.
Yeah, I mean, just one of those offensive lineman guys that kind of like, he's just a guy, but he's a solid player and one you won't win without. And I do remember that that was the concussion movie, where that's one of the, like, they show the footage from the accident. Mm-hmm. And it is kind of sad that he had such a tragic end to his life. But boy, can you imagine somebody like bums cigarettes off somebody?
Yeah.
Like, it'll be all over Twitter.
Yeah. Probably not a lot of smoking going on in NFL locker rooms today. If I had to guess.
Yeah, and definitely not like media members like bumming cigarettes off.
Right.
A different world. Like as like getting old, it's a different world that we grew up in.
Yes.
Next up was Rob Scuderi. He was a Penguins defenseman. He was most known for making a save in Game 6 of the Stanley Cup Final to force a Game 7. They called him Key Piece, jokingly given by his teammates. I think he already had a nickname, Scuds. He was also known as the Piece.
Yeah, that was because they were interviewing him, and he said, he meant to say, yeah. The interviewer was asking him like what his significance that year, and he said, yeah, I think he meant to say, I think I'm a piece of the puzzle, and instead of a piece, he said the piece. And he just misspoke. He didn't really mean that. He wasn't trying to be arrogant. And his teammates just would never let him forget that. It's like, oh, here comes the piece. We can't win without the piece. Meanwhile, he's like the sixth defenseman. But, that was kind of all in good fun. And you said about Ernie Mills, we don't make it to the Super Bowl that year without Ernie Mills. We probably don't win the Stanley Cup in 2009 without Rob Scuderi.
He did play a little goalie there at the end of that one Game 6. I mean, really, that was like a kick save. Like he couldn't. Like, too, is like you can't put your hand over the puck. So, and he was on his knees. He had to, he played goalie without using his hands. It was odd.
If he would have put his hand over the puck, It would have been a penalty shot.
Yeah.
Which with like 4 seconds left, which probably would have sent the game into overtime. So stopping the puck and not using his hand to do it was one of those significant moments that maybe gets lost in Pittsburgh history, but that was pretty significant.
Good old the piece. So he was the key piece, and he knew it all along.
He was right. Next guy on our list is Zane Smith. Zane Smith was a major league pitcher. And in the 1990 season, the Pirates were making this pennant run, and they were battling it out with the New York Mets, and they really needed another quality starting pitcher, badly needed another starting pitcher. And so they make a trade deadline deal with the Montreal Expos to get Zane Smith, who was a veteran. And they gave up a pretty big haul to get Zane Smith. They gave up a guy named Moises Alou, who ended up becoming a 6-time All-Star. So that was pretty hefty to give up Moises Alou. It was a huge prospect at the time. But they got Zane Smith. They ended up winning the division. And Zane Smith really helped them do that season. His best performance was he had a 1-hit complete game shutout of the Mets and the first game of a doubleheader sweep that really gave the Pirates an insurmountable lead. And then the next year he actually won 16 games for the Pirates. So those early 90s teams, you always remember Barry Bonds and Doug Drabeck and Andy Van Slyke. Zane Smith was pretty important to those teams as well, and just a guy that was a pretty significant contributor.
He had kind of a weird smile, I remember. And speaking of Moises Alou, there's a guy you wouldn't want to shake his hand. Or did he urinates on his hand to improve his ability to catch the ball. So if you ever meet Moises Alou in person, just kind of maybe wave at him. Don't want to meet him.
After this whole COVID virus, I'm not sure anybody's going to be shaking hands with anybody anymore.
But Zane Smith, I mean, it's one of those go for it trades, and I guess it worked out for them for 2 years. I mean, who knows how much Moises Alou would have maybe they would have been better off keeping him, or maybe they just wouldn't even made it that year without Zane Smith. So hindsight's always 20/20. You never know how it's going to work out. But Zane Smith, I mean, it's a guy people forget about because the Pirates never won anything with him. And I mean, I guess who were their bigger pitchers back then too? I mean, Drabeck and.
Well, Drabeck, and then the next year, John Smiley won 20 games the next year.
Okay.
So yeah, Zane Smith was definitely not the ace of the staff at any point, but like you said, maybe they don't get as far as they did without him. And that's really what we're trying to go for in this episode. A lot of these guys, you can't win without the big stars, but then sometimes you can't win without some of these role players. And so maybe Zane Smith is one of those guys that they wouldn't have made it as far as they did without him.
Another guy that kind of fits in on the B team is one Max Starks. And Max Starks is the second biggest person I've met in my life. He is a humongous human being. I met him at a charity event one time, and there was literally a crowd of people because it's oh my gosh, it's a Steeler. And he was literally, everybody came up to maybe his shoulder, and you could like see from his shoulder to his, like, he was that much taller than everybody else. But is on the field, he was a great tackle for those teams for years. And I remember Ben wanted him to come back one time, and Tomlin asked him if he was going to make weight. So I guess Max had a little bit of trouble making weight, but when he was in his prime, he was definitely a solid tackle, and helped the Steelers win a couple Super Bowls. And generally a nice guy, and all around decent person from the 5 minutes I interacted with him.
So Steve, I got to ask, who was the biggest person you ever met?
He's later in the list.
Ooh,
he's actually
okay.
On the list, yes.
Okay, that's a good teaser.
He's the biggest human being I've ever met in person, and that's saying something. He is bigger than Max Starks.
Okay, wow.
It's not even close, really.
All right. Well, next on the list is another guy, maybe not as big as Starks, but a pretty big guy for the Steelers in size-wise. It was Kimo von Oelhoffen. Kimo von Oelhoffen had played for the Cincinnati Bengals early in his career, and most people didn't know who he was, but Dermontti Dawson did. Dermontti Dawson was the Steelers Hall of Fame center, and he actually told the coaches and the front office people that Kimo von Oelhoffen was one of the toughest players that he ever had to block against. He played against him twice a year, and he said, this guy's really hard to block. And so the Steelers brought him in free agency in 2000. And it was sort of one of those signings that was way off the radar. Nobody thought it was significant. And, he very quietly became a starter in the middle of the defensive line, and and became a pretty significant player. He'll always be remembered for breaking Carson Palmer's leg in the 2005 playoff game, which was obviously not intentional, despite what Cincinnati fans might tell you. It was just a freak accident. But that shouldn't overshadow the fact that he actually had a pretty solid career with the Steelers.
Another class act guy. I remember him saying, like, he was kind of like, we talk about that tight knit 2004, 2005 team, and he was part of like one of the key like glue guys. Like I would say like a Ferrier. Ferrier was a better player. Von Oelhoffen was a great run stopper, and he could give you some pass rush too. But it's unfortunate that he accidentally got pushed into Carson Palmer. It's not. I don't think that was Von Oelhoffen's intent. It just was a freak accident. But Cincinnati's gonna be Cincinnati, so. But I mean, he's a likable guy, and I just remember him saying, one time about the Steelers is they don't normally sign, idiots or they don't last very long in the locker room. So maybe the Steelers should go back to that policy, because they definitely strayed away from it in the last couple of years. But another real likable guy, quiet guy. Don't hear much from, doesn't really, I don't know where he lives or what he does. I guess just quietly retired somewhere, living off his, NFL money, hopefully. Next up is another guy from my childhood, a guy who I liked, and this guy was here during the drug years of the Pirates. He was Jason Thompson. And in typical Pirates fashion, they tried to trade him to the Yankees. He played for Detroit, where he had the nickname Upper Deck or Rooftop or something like that, because he would hit it over the roof in old Tiger Stadium. So like they tried like some three-way trade, and I guess the commissioner of baseball's like a commissioner in a fantasy league that it was too lopsided. So the Pirates ended up stuck with Jason Thompson, who actually ended up being like a solid player. He would I remember him hitting home runs, and like, I just remember going there, and they were really bad. Like that 84, 85 season, that was the drug years. Like, road trip to Pittsburgh was like, yay, let's get drugs, But Jason Thompson wasn't involved with that. That was more Dale Berra and Parker. But he had a decent career, and just kind of had a mediocre career. Didn't see much success or a World Series, because unfortunately he got traded to the Pirates at the time they stunk.
Yeah, it's one of those things where had he come along 5 years earlier or 5 years later, a lot more people would probably know who he is.
Mm-hmm.
Next guy on the list is Mark Eaton. Mark Eaton was a big lumbering defenseman for the Pittsburgh Penguins. He was signed as a free agent in 2006 and didn't really do much in his first couple of seasons, but then became a really solid player on the 2009 team that won the Cup. He had a lot of injuries the previous seasons, but he was finally healthy in 2009. And when you look at the stats from that year, and the stats for defensemen, Sergei Gonchar and Chris Letang led the team in points during that Stanley Cup run in the playoffs, which makes sense. Gonchar and Letang were the two best defensemen on the team, clearly. But right behind them, the third guy on the list was actually Mark Eaton. Had a pretty good playoff run and really contributed to that Cup team. Fun fact about Mark Eaton, he's the only NHL player to come from the state of Delaware.
Yeah. I remember Penn's blog had they would have write-ups of the game, and they were always fun to read. And it was Delaware's got your back, and whenever Mark Eaton would make a play. So it was always fun to read. Like another great B team guy, like just that glue guy that you need behind your top pair of defensemen to take on the other team's thing. Probably like someone that's controversial, and this is just one of my favorite players. I love this guy at Pitt. He was a very good defensive back and a kick returner. And the Steelers drafted him. So it was like my favorite NFL team drafted, probably one of my favorite college players at the time, and that was Hank Poteet. Hank Poteet was pretty, as a defensive back, he did not have a good run with the Steelers, but he was still a pretty good kick returner, and he had good punt returns and kick returns, but he never quite developed as a defensive back. Now, he did end up having a 10-year career in the NFL. He won a Super Bowl in 2004 with the Patriots, actually made some plays in that 2004 championship games when he with the Patriots as a backup defensive back and special teams player. So, I mean, it wasn't all, maybe it just took him a little while to find his niche, but definitely a B team guy and somebody probably people remember more negatively than positively, although I think that might be a little unfair. Maybe he just hadn't quite hit his stride as he did. Obviously, I mean, the NFL just doesn't keep people around just for fun, He definitely had definitely later success with the Patriots and Jets.
Yeah, Steve, I'm with you. I was so excited when the Steelers drafted him because, like you, he was one of my favorite Pitt players, and he was a pretty good defensive back on some pretty bad Pitt teams, and he just wasn't that good as a defensive back for the Steelers. His big moment for the Steelers, he returned a punt for a touchdown in the final game ever at Three River Stadium. Yeah. So at least he had that sort of on his resume, something you could remember Hank Poteet's Steeler time by. Next guy on the list is Tony Dungy. Now, everybody knows who Tony Dungy is, obviously. All-time great coach, won the Super Bowl as a coach of the Colts, became the first African-American coach ever to win the Super Bowls, is on TV all the time. So we all know who Tony Dungy is. But he's on this list for his time as a player. He actually played on the Steelers in the late 70s. So he was on some of those great 1970s teams. He was mostly a backup. He never was a huge contributor, but another guy that kind of played above his pay grade. The 78 team, which is widely considered one of the best teams in NFL history, the 78 Steelers, he led that team with 6 interceptions. So that's saying something. That defense, you think about that defense and who was on that defense, and he led that defense in interceptions. He's also the only Steeler ever to make an interception and throw an interception in the same game. He was pressed into service as like an emergency quarterback. And so he threw and made an interception in the same game. So Tony Dungy, definitely didn't have a huge impact as a player, but obviously learned a thing or two playing for those great Steelers teams and applied that later in his life as a coach.
Was Dungy ever a coach? I thought he did assistant coach with the Steelers for a little bit, didn't he?
I mean, he was an assistant coach with the Steelers. I just meant he applied it later as a head coach in general. with the Buccaneers and then obviously with the Colts.
Yeah, I'm not a huge Tony Dungy fan, but he definitely has a short impact, but definitely a good B team guy, like one of those guys that made some plays that you definitely needed. He's not going to carry you, but you got to have guys like that, like you said, these role players to take the heat off the big time, big names. Chris Hoke, who is a nose tackle for the Steelers, he's guys kind of went in the media, so maybe he's more well known than some of the other players. His best season was 2004. He filled in for Casey Hampton, and he helped the defensive rotation through the years and ended up being a really solid nose tackle, which in the 3-4 doesn't get a ton of credit or ballyhoo, but definitely a guy that made some plays and even credited with the tackle in Super Bowl 40, and he was on both Super Bowl teams of 40 and 43.
Yeah, another guy you could always count on. Casey Hampton was the guy that really played that position for most of that era, but Hampton got hurt sometimes, and Hoke was just one of those guys you could count on to just be able to plug in there. Hampton also, sometimes couldn't play. Let's just say sometimes he got winded.
Yeah.
So Chris Hoke, yeah, he ended up playing a lot, and you're right. There was just times you'd see him make a big play. Next guy on the list is Orlando Antigua, who was a basketball player at Pitt in the early 90s. Had the misfortune of playing for the early 90s. Paul Evans coached Pitt basketball teams that weren't very good. I shouldn't say that. Some of those teams were okay. They made a couple tournament appearances, but certainly not anywhere near what the Pitt basketball program later became under Ben Howland and Jamie Dixon. His big thing was he was a really good 3-point shooter, and college basketball had just recently added the 3-point line. College basketball didn't have a 3-point line for a long time, and I want to say it was like 1987, 88, around that time that they finally added a 3-point line. And Orlando Antigua was a little bit of a pioneer because he was one of the first guys to really use that as a skill. And you see a lot of college and pro players obviously doing that today, using the 3-point line as a weapon. But he was one of the first guys that did that and was really good at it. He also went on to be a college head coach, and also before he became a college head coach, he played for the Harlem Globetrotters for several years. So kind of had an interesting post-Pitt career, but pretty good player at Pitt that a lot of people probably don't remember as a player, but pretty solid and one of the first guys to figure out, hey, this 3-point line, I could use this to my advantage.
He was definitely a different type of player, and he's had good success coaching too. Like I was just looking at that, Kentucky and South Florida and Illinois as an assistant. I mean, he's kind of followed, I guess he's a Calipari guy. So he definitely has had probably a little bit more success, I would say, coaching than he did in his playing career.
Yeah.
But definitely a solid role player. And was that the guy you and Mark ran into in the mall?
Or
was that Mark? So. Or was it Mark? I remember. Yeah, they ran into him in the mall and harassed him. Like, "Are you going to the NBA?" He's like, "I don't know."
Yeah, I certainly around that time. If you ever saw anybody in a mall or anything, then you wanted to have a story to tell, so you wanted to say something to them.
I'm sure he remembers that vividly. Yeah. And moving on, another good B team guy is a guy named Matt Columbus. He was a pretty mediocre Pitt linebacker, but his big play was in 2000. He made another play. He did make a tackle against Georgia Tech. We'll cover that later. I covered another guy, but 2016 upset at Clemson. Clemson had a 4th and 1, and if they get the 4th down, the game's over, and Pitt doesn't get a chance to kick their game-winning field goal. He made a nice tackle on 4th and 1 on Wayne Gallman, who is the running back for Clemson, and they came up short, and Pitt was able to drive down, and Chris Blewett kicked the now famous field goal. But Columbus always seemed to step slow. He seemed like he was just like a big, oafy linebacker. But they used to Narduzzi always called him, I guess, the human computer because he was pretty smart, and he maybe used up his ability to diagnose a play and where it was going before he would, that would help him maybe make up for some of his limits as speed, not being maybe the fastest linebacker in the world.
Yeah, and that stop on 4th and 1, I mean, that might have been the biggest Pitt victory of the last, I don't know, 5-10 years, beating Clemson in Clemson. So that was a pretty significant play. Next guy on the list is Willie Williams. We did an episode called 3 More Yards where we talked about the 95 Steelers and the run to Super Bowl 30. And we talked a lot about Willie Williams in that episode. Willie Williams was a cornerback who was short and slow, which are normally 2 characteristics that are not real good if you're an NFL cornerback. But man, he was an overachiever, and he was pressed into the starting lineup that season. And like Ernie Mills, who we talked about earlier, you could certainly make the argument that we don't make the Super Bowl without Willie Williams. He makes a tackle in the AFC title game that is legendary, and again, the Steelers don't make the Super Bowl without that play. So just a guy that was, an overachiever, played pretty well when he was here, and fondly remembered, I think, by the folks that watched him play.
Next up, another corner for the Steelers who probably overachieved was Deshea Townsend. At first, the only reason you knew him was because, hey, wait a minute, he's wearing Rod Woodson's number, 26. But he definitely kind of transformed himself into a special teams player and then a very reliable starter at corner. And, I mean, he was a starter at corner, and then they drafted McFadden, and he kind of became this other this third corner, and they ended up with 3 pretty good corners on their defense after that. So Deshea Townsend, definitely that guy. People probably remember him more, for those Super Bowl runs. He was definitely a key figure on those teams. I think he used to have his own radio show, so maybe a little bit that more memorable, but definitely a nice role player and the guy who contributed mightily to the Super Bowl 40 win.
Yeah, he was on both those Super Bowl teams, and in that 2008 season, he's the one that makes the interception against Tony Romo in the Dallas game in the final seconds of that game to break a tie.
I wonder if Tony predicted that before he took the snap. He's like, I'm throwing right to 26.
So yeah, Deshea was part of that 98 class too. That was the year they drafted Faneca and Hines Ward. And I think Deshea was the 4th round pick. I think Faneca was in the 1st round, Ward was in the 3rd, and Deshea was in the 4th. And all 3 of those guys played for the Steelers for a long time. Deshea was here for, I think, 12 seasons. I mean, that's a long time. So definitely a big contributor. Next guy on the list is Ian Moran. Ian Moran played for the Penguins. So we just said Deshea Townsend was here for a long time. Ian Moran played 9 seasons for the Penguins. And the big thing about Ian Moran, he was very, very serviceable and versatile. He played almost every position on the ice other than goaltender. They kept moving him between forward and defenseman. And, just ended up being one of those guys you could always count on. Probably the most famous play he made, Mario Lemieux scored a very dramatic goal in his final home game in the Civic Arena against the Flyers. This was before he retired the first time. And it was on a breakaway. Moran's the one that sprung him on that breakaway. And again, no one would ever remember who made the pass. Just remember that Mario scored the goal. But he was just that guy, very quiet, very versatile, serviceable. Fun thing about him, the Penguins ended up, after 9 seasons, trading him to the Boston Bruins in 2003. And there's a story where Moran found out about the trade while he was playing hopscotch in his driveway with his daughter. And he ended up having to write the phone number of the Bruins general manager in driveway chalk because he didn't have a piece of paper or anything. So that's kind of funny that he's sitting there writing the number in chalk on his driveway so he could call the Bruins general manager and find out, what's going to happen next.
Good times for Ian Moran there. Definitely a B team guy.
Yes.
Another guy, maybe starts some controversy. He might be more than a B team guy. Was Antoine Randall L. He was a wide receiver kick returner for the Steelers. Definitely the most accomplished player on this list. And he had a great kick return, punt return against the Cleveland in that playoff game where they had a big comeback. He also threw a touchdown pass to clinch Super Bowl 40. He really was a great college quarterback for Indiana, but unlike maybe Tim Tebow, he was smart enough to figure out that quarterback wasn't going to make it for him in the NFL. So he turned to wide receiver and ended up having like a really decent career and probably made a lot of money after he went to Washington. But definitely I would not, I mean, it was always kind of Plexico, Hines, and then Randall L. And then I guess the year after Plexico had left, and I guess he kind of he took a more prominent role, and that would have been the Super Bowl 40 run. But still, I don't think he was quite, like, I don't know if he made any Pro Bowls. I didn't look that up, but.
No, I think he belongs on this list. See, the thing with Randall L is you remember him throwing the touchdown pass in the Super Bowl. He even came back to the Steelers later in his career, and I think he was responsible for like a 2-point conversion against the Packers in that Super Bowl when we were starting to come back at the end. You just remember that he always made these like gadget plays or special teams plays that were important. But if you had no idea who Antoine Randall L was and you just looked at his stat sheet, he's a forgettable, mediocre wide receiver. And so I think people remember him because he made some of those big plays, and they were always like trick plays. But I still think he belongs on the list because he certainly never had any kind of like stardom, real stardom. Like actually,
well, he definitely took Danny Snyder's money, that's for sure.
yeah. Did not end up doing a whole lot for the Redskins when they signed him. That's why he ended up coming back to the Steelers eventually. But yeah, another guy that, again, do you win the Super Bowl that year without Antoine Randall L? You could make the argument that you don't. Sticking with the Steelers, next guy on our list is big play Willie Gay. Spent 10 seasons with the Steelers. And this is just one of those stats you would never realize until you went and looked it up. But he's tied with Rod Woodson. Rod Woodson, the Hall of Famer, all-time great Steeler, for the most defensive touchdowns in team history. Willie Gay had seven touchdowns, and this is a guy that was not always a starter. Was kind of one of those like third down defensive backs. But man, when he got the ball, and he just always seemed to find the end zone, whether it was an interception or a fumble return or what have you. Another thing about William Gay, he had a really tragic backstory. His mother, when he was a kid, his mother was murdered by her boyfriend. He was 8 years old, and it was a domestic violence situation. And he always spoke out and became an advocate for domestic violence. And if anybody remembers the whole thing that happened with Ray Rice, the running back for the Baltimore Ravens, it was caught on video punching his girlfriend and basically got blackballed from the NFL for that act. William Gay, instead of standing up and saying, "Oh yeah, what a terrible guy," and I'm glad they threw him out of the league, he was one of the guys that said, he wanted to reach out to Ray Rice and, share his experience. And I just always thought that showed a lot of character. Like, here's a guy that was, his mother was killed due to domestic violence, and yet he wanted to reach out to Ray Rice. So I always thought that's kind of shows what kind of person William Gay was. And I thought he was, 10 seasons with the Steelers is nothing to sneeze at, and 7 defensive touchdowns. So he definitely left his mark.
He was definitely, I think, a favorite of Tomlin's. Sometimes like a coach likes a guy. Like it's same thing with Hank Poteet. I think Eric Mangini really liked Hank Poteet. So that's why he kind of followed Mangini around. Because that was Mangini was with the Patriots and then those other teams. And I just remember one time William Gay scored a defensive touchdown, I think in Cincinnati. And him and I think Joey Porter was a coach at the time. Like they had the most ridiculous touchdown celebration. Like they were on their knees and it looked like they were playing the claw from like Liar Liar. It was just the silliest thing I think I've ever seen. But big play Willie Gay, man. He made a huge interception against, there was a game where Ben threw that kind of controversial touchdown to Holmes in Baltimore, and then Baltimore threw a last, desperation pass. He made the interception there. So he definitely had some big plays in Steeler history, and definitely somebody easy to overlook, and good to hear that he was as good off the field as he was, on the field. Going back to definitely somebody who I'm sure people have forgot about was a gentleman named Siobhan Troutman. And he was a power forward for Pitt for the early 2000s. He was more of like a defensive rebounder, but he was like not the great. Like he wasn't going to shoot threes. He didn't really even have a mid-range jumper, but he could play really good defense. And that was back in like the Big East when they would like let you like put your hands on people and like, wrestle a little bit more under the basket. And he had a strong inside game, and but he just never really had much of an outside shot. And I remember him seeing in interviews, and maybe he just doesn't do well in interviews, but he came off as like maybe not the sharpest tool in the shed. He maybe wasn't, but as of this podcast, he's still playing overseas basketball. So he's had himself a nice little career after Pitt. Even though he didn't make it to the NBA, he was good enough to play all those years in overseas. So good for him.
Yeah. Chevy Troutman was definitely one of those guys that, just an important component to those teams that almost kind of broke through. Next guy on our list is Jay Bell. Jay Bell was a shortstop for the Pirates, and the Pirates, we talked about how the '80s were not kind to the Pirates, and they were building under Jim Leyland. They were building this pretty good team, and the big gap was the shortstop. In the late '80s, they kept rotating. They had these guys. They had Rafael Belliard and Felix Fermin and Al Pedrique. They just kept. They had this like rotating list of shortstops that couldn't do anything, and they picked up Jay Bell from Cleveland, and he ended up becoming the starter shortstop for the next 8 seasons, and was really solidified that infield and allowed them to make the division championship runs that they made in the early 90s. He was definitely a part of, I think, a key piece of that. Nowhere near a Barry Bonds or Bobby Bonilla or those guys, but that was a position they needed to shore up, and he did that. In 1993, he won the National League Gold Glove Award at shortstop, and that was significant because for the previous 13 seasons, that had been won by Ozzie Smith, the all-time great shortstop for the Cardinals, and Jay Bell broke that string in 1993. So that shows you how good he was defensively. Also, he later went on to play for the Arizona Diamondbacks, and in the 2001 World Series, they won that World Series on a dramatic Game 7 walk-off hit, and Jay Bell's the guy that scored the winning run. So that's kind of he's probably even more well remembered in Arizona than he is here. But I always thought a very significant contributor to those early 90s Pirate teams.
Do you remember, you're speaking of the guys that came before him, do you remember Sammy Khalifa?
Oh, yeah, I forgot Sammy Khalifa.
Yeah, I remember the paper had a big article, the shortstop of the future. But yeah, Felix Fermin too. I remember like Vince Lachey when Felix he played the Felix the Cat song from the cartoon. But Jay Bell, I remember one other thing about Jay Bell, like he had that weird bunt when he was about to bunt. Like, most guys kind of like sneak it in there. Like he would literally like be in his bunting stance as he would walk up to the batter's box. It was like when Jay Bell was going to bunt, there was no mystery about it. It was like, this is a bunt. But yeah, like you said, an all-around really solid and good player. Glad to see you won a World Series, and like you said, probably more fondly remembered if this was a Diamondbacks podcast. Get a little bit more love than we gave him, although he was definitely a key part to those early 90s Pirates teams. Another guy that was a key part that I think still falls under the radar. Some people might disagree with me. I don't really hear people talk about him, and that's Aaron Smith. He was a defensive end for the Steelers, and he was in defensive end on a 3-4 is kind of like nose tackle, at least some people seem to notice that, but defensive ends for some reason don't get noticed because they are taking on blocks or, freeing up stuff for the linebackers is kind of their job. Well, he was pretty anonymous except for some guy named Bill Belichick, who called him the best defensive player in the NFL in 2004. That was, a high compliment from Bill Belichick. And one time I remember went to a Colts game, I think the year we won Super Bowl 43. And normally in the NFL, like you'll see a guy and he'll make a play here and there, but he literally dominated so much against, like, first the Colts tried to like single team him and he makes like a play, blows up the play. Then they try double team. Then they try like running backs and tight ends. And he's just blowing through these guys like the whole first half. It got so bad that like in the second half, they're like, okay, we're just going to roll Peyton Manning out. Like he literally like eliminated half the field from the Colts offense just single-handedly. Unfortunately, the Steelers, I think, ended up losing that game. That was Ike Taylor tipped the ball to Marvin Harrison, and they couldn't score on the 1 yard line. But Aaron Smith is he's a low-key guy. He doesn't get a lot of press. He seems like, people, reporters have written about him and stuff, but he just doesn't get a lot of publicity like some of the other maybe more known, like Troy Polamalu's or, Joey Porter's or James Harrison's on those teams.
Yeah, what I remember about Aaron Smith is like late in his career, maybe his last season or second last season, he got hurt early in the season, and they said, "Oh, Aaron Smith's done for the season," and people lamented it like as if Ben Roethlisberger or Troy Polamalu had been hurt for the season, And outside of Pittsburgh, you probably wouldn't have thought much about, defensive lineman Aaron Smith out for the season, but it was a big loss, and not only fans but teammates, really lamented, oh my gosh, what are we going to do without Aaron Smith? So he was definitely a very significant part of those teams. Next guy on the list is John Turman. John Turman was a quarterback at Pitt, and one of my favorite Pitt seasons will always be the 2000 season. It was the year in between when they tore down Pitt Stadium and they built Heinz Field. So they played that year at Three River Stadium, and it wasn't a real good team, but man, was the offense fun to watch that year. It was just like, we're throwing deep. Every play, we're throwing deep. And they had a receiver named Antonio Bryant, who was really, really good, and another wide receiver named Lateef Grimm, who was also pretty good. And but they needed somebody to get them the ball, and that was John Turman was good at that. He was good at throwing deep. He was good at getting those guys the ball. And again, like I said, it wasn't a great team, but it was a really fun team to watch. Bryant that year averaged almost 20 yards per reception. So if that gives you a little bit of an idea of, what kind of offense they ran that year, their best receiver averaged 20 yards per catch, and the guy getting them the ball that year was John Turman. So I always have good memories of John Turman of that season. I know, Steve, you and I went to a couple of games that year at Three Rivers together. It was I just remember that being a fun season. And Turman was not a great quarterback, but could throw the ball deep and was fun to watch.
Another part of that offense was they had Barlow at running back. So
oh yeah,
I remember it was like any way you want to do it, because like they ended up beating West Virginia at the end of the year, and I think West Virginia decided, well, we'll just keep everybody back, and I think Barlow ended up having like 200 yards rushing. So they really could like score any way. And I remember, I think that was the year also they lost to North Carolina at home.
It was. The Willie Parker game.
Yeah, Willie Parker, Ronald Curry, and Jeff Reed were, yeah. What is frustrating is nobody knew Turman was like diabetic apparently, or they hadn't figured it out. And they had like 3 shots at the end zone late in that game to like pull out the win, and here like Turman hadn't checked his blood sugar. So he got all loopy. And like, I just remember him like badly overthrowing Bryant 3 times in the end zone. So poor John Turman. And he just never panned out like any after that year. He kind of had 1 year, and that was kind of it for him.
Yep.
Kind of a product, I guess, of Antonio Bryant and Barlow and Lateef Grimm, having some really good players.
Yes.
Moving back to hockey, a guy named Ruslan Fedotenko. he was a decent left wing. He benefited from playing with Malkin, Crosby, and Stahl. But mainly, it was a great inside joke with my son. I don't know. I guess I just like the name Ruslan because when my son would play hockey, I'd call him Ruslan, and it would just annoy him. So I just call him a little Ruslan just for fun. But decent player. That's the only reason I really remember him was just he had a funky name, and it was fun to harass people with it.
Yeah, he was on that 09 team that won the cup, and so I think any Pittsburgh player that played on a championship team always has kind of like their own special place in everybody's hearts. I do remember, the way his career in Pittsburgh ended in the 2010 playoffs. They were playing Ottawa, and we had played Ottawa a bunch of times in the playoffs back then. I believe that was the third time in 4 years that we were playing Ottawa in the playoffs. And we were playing an elimination game. We were up 3-1 in series, and the game goes into triple overtime. So if the Penguins can just score the next goal, the series is over. And Ottawa was famous back then. They had these guys, they had these really good skill players that just would give up in the playoffs, like Jason Spezza, guys like that. Once you had them on their backs, they just were like, yeah, I don't really want to play hockey anymore. And in this triple overtime game, their whole team is selling out. Their season's on the line. Even guys like Spezza and Alfredsson, they're diving on the ice to block pucks. And Matt Cartner for the Senators, he gets the puck in triple overtime, and Ruslan Fedotenko is standing right in front of him, and he just stands there and lets Matt Cartner shoot it, and the puck goes into the net. And a lot of Penguins fans, that left a bad taste in their mouth. Like, everybody's selling out, everybody's diving on the ice, even their quitters were diving on the ice, and you just kind of stood there and watched the puck go right past you. And that was kind of the end of Fedotenko's time in Pittsburgh. I don't know how many people still remember that, but I remember at the time, man, people were not Ruslan Fedotenko fans after he didn't sell out in triple overtime the way that everybody else kind of was doing. So
it's not how Ruslan rolls.
What's that?
That's not how Ruslan rolls.
Yeah, apparently not.
No. Homestead Charlie.
Is he next?
Yes, he is.
Charlie Batch.
Yes, he is.
Yeah, so Charlie Batch, was a Homestead native who spent, amazingly, 11 years as the Steelers' backup quarterback. That's a long time to be a backup, especially in this day and age, right? That might not have been a long time back in the pre-free agency days of the NFL, but in this era, that's a long time to be on one team as the backup. And Charlie was always dependable. Always could count on him. When Ben sometimes got hurt, Ben had that style where he held onto the ball a long time, took a lot of hits. Offensive line wasn't very good in that era. So Batch was pressed into service more than once, and you always felt comfortable. If Ben was hurt short term, you always felt like Charlie Batch could come out and win you a few games. Probably his big signature win was in his final season. He started a game in Baltimore and led a last-second come-from-behind victory over the Ravens, who won the Super Bowl that year in 2012. And so that was kind of his big moment. And there's a great image of him just collapsing into Ben's arms on the sidelines in tears after winning that game. So Charlie Batch, one of those guys from here, played for the Steelers, well-liked. Just a guy just a good, dependable, well-liked Pittsburgh guy.
Yeah, he does stuff in the community and seems to, I don't know if he's done radio. I think he does a radio show or did a radio show. So he's kept his name kind of in the media and generally all around good person. He has charities in the area. I think he does a Christmas toy drive and, just all around good guy and a decent, not like a great player. I remember they always called him Check Down Charlie. But I remember I went to a game, I think the first game against the Dolphins one year after I think it was the year after they won the Super Bowl. And I think maybe it was after Ben had his motorcycle accident or something. But Charlie Batch ended up playing that game and they ended up winning. So, I mean, he definitely, if you needed somebody just to kind of come in and right the ship and, at least give you a stable quarterback play, he was your guy.
Yeah, the game you're talking about, Steve, you and I were both at that game. I still have a picture of us standing at that game. It was the opening game of the 2006 season, and it was the Thursday night, like, because we had won the
Yeah.
Super Bowl the year before, and Nick Saban was coaching the Dolphins that year. He was the new coach of the Dolphins, so that was like, oh, the defending champions against Nick Saban, and Charlie Batch had to start because, as you mentioned, Ben had the motorcycle accident, and in that game he threw an 85-yard touchdown pass to Heath Miller in the final minute of the game, and that's what won the game. So to your point, always dependable.
Yeah, I remember Wes Welker was for the Dolphins, and Dante Culpepper was pretty bad at quarterback for the Dolphins. Like he everything he threw was either in the dirt or over people's heads. But yet we still needed a last second Charlie Batch heroics to put the Dolphins to bed there.
Yep.
Sticking with local guys, this is a guy that probably not a lot of people remember or know, but I met him just after college and personal life, and he's a decent person, and I do remember him playing, and I always liked him. He was a solid college player, had no illusions of going pro. You knew he wasn't going pro, but he was still a good player, and that's Mark Ponko. And he played strong safety at Pitt from 98 to 2001. Like I said, he's like your stereotypical college player. He's like a good player who's like just going to get his degree and move on with his life like he did. I think he sells insurance somewhere in Plum. But, just decent person and a good guy. And he's told me some Walt Harris stories. I guess he's not a big Walt Harris fan. I guess Walt Harris was rubbed people the wrong way even back then. So, but like I said, he was the Pitt teams had some later success in the 2000s and 2001. They finally made some bowl games, and probably a good experience and kind of reward for his college career there at the end.
Also had a great Pittsburgh name, Mark Ponko.
Ponko's going to be an exception.
Next guy on our list is Johnny Ray. Johnny Ray was a second baseman for the Pirates during the 1980s. So, Steve, you mentioned some of your favorite guys from those awful, forgettable Pittsburgh drug trial era Pirates. Johnny Ray was the second baseman. He was one of my favorite players from those teams. He was a really, really consistent hitter. He's actually a career 290 hitter, which is pretty good. And he never really got any recognition because, again, the Pirates were not only an awful team, but they were at the epicenter of those drug trials. And that was also at the time that the Galbraiths were trying to sell the team and potentially move them out of town. So what was going on in the field was just almost secondary at that point. But Johnny Ray was a pretty solid second baseman and a good hitter.
I remember going to, now this had to be the old Buell Planetarium or maybe the Children's Museum. They had this game where you would simulate. It was Johnny Ray, and he had a swing simulator, and you would piece together this electronic buttons, and if you hit the certain buttons, depending on the pitch would be random, either fastball, curveball, whatever, and you would have to pick the right swing to hit it. And then Laney Fateri would narrate it, what happened. It'd be oh, Johnny Ray strikes out, or Johnny Ray hits a 2-run home run, or I just remember that more for Johnny Ray playing that game at it was either the Children's Museum or the Buell Planetarium. I'm showing my age since neither of those places exist. Well, I think the Children's Museum, but I doubt they have the old Johnny Ray swing simulator laying around somewhere.
That's one of those
things. Which would be great
things.
if they did, yeah.
Well, that's one of those things that you whatever you're referring to there, the only people that remember it would be kids like us that played it, or maybe the people that worked there at the time. But I doubt anybody has a picture of it or a video of it, because back then you didn't have your camera or your cell phone, to do all that stuff with. So that's
and it was pretty advanced for 1984, 85. I mean, to have that kind of somebody really spent some time programming that. Oh my gosh, I can only imagine, And it was cool because Laney Fateri, they actually had Laney Fateri would, whatever the outcome was. Obviously, it was if you pick this swing with a slider, you're going to either get a hit or strike, So I guess I'm assuming that's how it worked.
Nice.
Another Pitt basketball guy on the list was, and this is just another guy that I liked. He maybe wasn't the greatest, Pitt basketball player of all time was Ontario Ouellette, but he was a great like offensive power. He didn't really play defense that well. He was kind of like when I played basketball, somebody was coming down the lane, he's probably just going to foul him. So Ontario Ouellette was, but he was pretty big, and he had a decent like jump shot, and he was big enough to where he could like muscle people out of the way in the old Big East and get easy points. Played in the heydays of Pitt basketball with Brandon Knight. And so he could get open, and Brandon Knight would hit him with a nice pass. So, and he returned to coach Pitt recently. So good for him. Nice little career. Although it was short, he only had 2 years at Pitt because he was a transfer. But nice guy, and guy that I just always liked. I don't know, maybe because he fouled a lot. I don't know. It reminded me of myself.
Yeah, he was a pretty good basketball player. Like you said, big guy, powerful guy. One of those guys that probably didn't stick out as much as some of the other players on those teams, but was definitely a pretty good player. Next on the list, Matt Cullen. So Matt Cullen, his nickname was Dad, and he came to the Penguins when he was in his 40s. So he was already, had a pretty long career at that point, but he helped them win 2 Stanley Cups in 2016 and 2017. He was a very gritty bottom line center, and, well liked by his teammates, well liked by the fans. And I always thought his best performance was the clincher against Nashville in 2017, Game 6, where they won the Stanley Cup. That game was 0-0 until I think it was about 90 seconds left when Hornqvist scored the goal to break the tie and win the cup for the Penguins. That game, he just was all over the ice that night. It was such a tight game. 0-0. Any game that's 0-0 for most of the game is going to be tightly played. And he was just all over the ice, usually matched up against Nashville's top guys. And, he'll never show up on a stat sheet anywhere for that game. But if you go back and watch it again, he just seems like he's everywhere. So Matt Cullen's a guy that, again, do you win 2 Stanley Cups without him? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I thought he contributed heavily to both those teams.
I think this is one of those guys where you're just squeezing the last little bit out of his skill set, because he was definitely at the end of his career. But sometimes if a player plays smart and kind of plays within themselves physically, they're veteran enough. They know how to play the game because they've done it so well. They can kind of make up for a lack of, physical, ability that's kind of left them. And I think that was kind of the Matt Cullen. He kind of falls into like the Shea Townsend. I think at the end of his career was kind of the same type of person, where they just could know where to position themselves in that sport to where they wouldn't get totally embarrassed. But and they definitely got, whatever little bit Matt Cullen had at the end. And he was a good locker room guy. That's a veteran in hockey. Definitely goes there. Going from Matt Cullen, the dad, to the Tim had asked earlier, who is the biggest person I have ever seen in real life? And that would be one Tyreek Jarrett. He was a defensive lineman at Pitt for 3 or 4 years. He is literally the biggest person I have met in person. He is listed at 6'3", 340. I say he's closer to 375. He's probably not a biscuit under 400. This guy is absolutely, he's not just like a fat guy either. He's tall. He is just a big wall of a human being. I remember one time, I think Pitt was playing Virginia, and one of the announcers on TV, they were trying to run the ball, and they said, "Yeah, you got to move the Death Star out of there." They literally called him the Death Star. He was still a very good player. There was a game against Georgia Tech where the game was tied late in the game, and Paul Johnson on 4th and 1 from his own 29, from the Georgia Tech 29, decided to go for it. And they literally, like Tyreek Jarrett just was literally a wall. Like him, and then I think Columbus and somebody else cleaned up, but they just like totally stopped him. When he hit, like I could hear the running back hit him from my seats, and it was just like, my dad literally looked at me and said, that guy just got stuffed. Like they literally wasn't even close. They still measured, but that guy didn't gain an inch. But fun player to watch. Shame he never got much of a chance in the pros. Probably maybe there were just weight issues, just too big for that. But one of my like underrated Pitt guys that I always like.
Yeah, and he had the misfortune of, being on that line sort of after Aaron Donald. And, he wasn't Aaron Donald, right? I mean, nobody was.
Yeah.
But very good player in his own right. Next guy on the list, Chris Fuamatu Ma'afala, who had one of the hardest to pronounce names in Steeler history. Big running back, played for the Steelers for 5 seasons. Never really put up a bunch of good stats. His best season was 2001. He played in all 16 games that year, mostly as a backup to Jerome Bettis, but did post 453 yards rushing. And, his signature moment came in the 2002 comeback win against the Browns in the playoffs. We did an episode about that. He scored the last-second touchdown to beat Cleveland. And not a guy that was ever really that good, but, a fun player to watch. Every time that he got the ball, fans would yell, "Foo!" So just a fun guy to have on the team. I think probably a running back that a lot of fans would remember, even though he never really, made a huge impact.
He seemed like he was hurt a lot at the end. And I remember one time he was on the injured reserve list, and then he went on like Monday Night Raw or something. And people were like, like he was like running around on Monday Night Raw. It's like, what are you doing, dude? But still a fun name, and scored a big touchdown in Steelers history. And he was like more of a third down back, I always thought, even though he was bigger. But good choice for a B-teamer guy. Another guy that's probably controversial, I don't know. I think he's a B-teamer because he only really made one big play. He's kind of the Antoine Randall category. And that would be Frank Pietrangelo. And he was a goalie for the Penguins from 88 to 92. He was pretty mediocre, but he made a big save against the Devils in Game 6 in their first Stanley Cup run. And that's considered the save that propelled them on their way to the winning the Stanley Cup that same year. But beyond that, Barrasso was definitely the starter and more of the star than Pietrangelo was. But much like a lot of other guys on this list, he had his one moment, and without that moment, maybe the Penguins don't, make the Stanley Cup run that year.
Yeah, they call it the save. I mean, so that tells you how it's known in Penguins history, and that was against Peter Stastny of the Devils. And you watch the replay of that years later, it's still amazing that he made that save. So he'll always have that moment in Pittsburgh sports history. Next guy on the list is Pete Gonzalez, who was a quarterback for Pitt in the 90s. Really inconsistent quarterback, but in the 1997 season, finally found his rhythm, led Pitt on a pretty amazing run to the Liberty Bowl that year. Pitt had failed to put together more than 3 wins in the previous 4 seasons. They were just a miserably awful team back then. And Pete Gonzalez led them to a bowl game. And on the way, he beat West Virginia in a memorable game in Morgantown, where the game was in overtime, and Pete Gonzalez converted a 4th and 17 in triple overtime to ultimately win the game for Pitt. So, beating West Virginia in Morgantown, that'll always get you good memories from Pitt fans. He actually later played for the Steelers. Not sure if he ever made it into like a regular season game. He was always like third stringer. But he did later play for the Steelers.
Yeah, he was always like that third string guy people were calling to see, like when the Steelers would be really bad and people would, I don't know. He was like, his big thing, the claim to fame too, he beat Miami, I think, that same year.
Yeah, that was the homecoming game at Pitt Stadium.
Which would be the last time they beat Miami at home till they were ranked second a couple years ago. I was at the second game, not the first. But I mean, he was definitely like a solid like college quarterback. Not the greatest quarterback in Pitt history, but I would definitely he definitely has notched his thing, and he's definitely turned it into a nice little career. You see him on the news media every so often, covering Steeler games or such. Sticking with football players, that brings us to a person that's currently still playing for the Steelers, and that's Alejandro Villanueva. He doesn't get a ton of credit, but maybe just more because he is a decorated war veteran and an Army Ranger. But he definitely took definitely was one of those guys that worked themselves into the NFL because, he was a tight end and not really a tackle when he played for Army. And so he had to gain some weight, and he bounced between the Eagles and the Steelers, kind of like pulled a James Harrison. And he definitely developed into one of the better tackles. I don't know if he's made a Pro Bowl or anything, but I always thought he always seems like he's pretty good and solid. You don't see him getting burned a ton. And another fun fact, he's caught a touchdown pass, and he does have two Pro Bowls experience, two Pro Bowls appearances, and he's one of the tallest players to play in the NFL. But definitely, I think from where he came from, he would be a B team guy because he definitely was not drafted. I don't think he was even drafted. He was a low to unrestricted free agent pick. So
yeah, another guy that's well liked by his teammates, well liked by the fans. Service to our country, all that stuff. Yeah, and definitely an overachiever. Next guy on the list is Jimmy Pack.
Oh,
Jimmy Pack was a defenseman for the Penguins. Won 2 Stanley Cups with the team in the early 90s. Scored a goal in the clincher against the Minnesota North Stars that first year. And serviceable guy. Never was a star. I think a lot of people remember Jim Pack locally because the DVE morning show, which is one of the big morning shows here in Pittsburgh, they always do a bit where they pretend that they have Mario Lemieux on the phone, and Mario Lemieux, the DVE Mario, is always saying like, "Oh yeah, Jim Pack picked up my my dry cleaning today or whatever." His Jim Pack also his notable achievement. He's the first Korean-born hockey player to play in the NHL, and then by extension also the first Korean-born hockey player to have his name engraved on the Stanley Cup.
Well, that's quite the accomplishment for Mr. Jim Pack there. I wonder if he still lives locally. He probably does. A lot of those guys do. But you knew we were going to win the cup when Jim Pack scored. You knew that game was pretty much over when he put one in the net
yes.
there on who was Eddie Belfour or was
John Casey. It was John.
Oh, it was
Casey.
John Casey?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, and not the psychic John Casey, the goaltender John. The other guy might have seen it coming, I guess. Moving back to Pitt football, there's another mediocre linebacker who just had one big moment with Pitt. That was Shane Murray. He was a Central Catholic grad. But in the WVU 13-9 game, he was like the up back on a punt. And Dave Wannstedt called a fake punt where he snuck under center and snuck the ball and got a big first down for Pitt to extend a drive. I think they ended up scoring on that later on that drive. So Shane Murray, not a well-sung name in Pitt annals, but I'm sure like hardcore Pitt fans will definitely remember him.
Yeah, we talked about him when we did the episode about that 13-9 game, which is still, maybe the most shocking outcome in the history of Pittsburgh sports. So, like you said, it came up big when it counted. Next guy on the list is Larry Anderson. Larry Anderson was a kick returner for the Steelers in the late 70s and early 80s. He played on both the 78 and 79 Super Bowl winning Steeler teams. And his kick return ability was pretty key in both of the Super Bowl wins, especially the 79 Super Bowl where they played the Los Angeles Rams. He did not return a kick for a touchdown in that game, so you'll never see him on any of the highlight reels or any of the Super Bowl memories things. But he had 162 yards in return, 162 return yards in that game on 5 returns. So that's a lot of return yardage. And so he set up the offense a lot of times in that game with short fields, and probably something that just gets forgotten. And so again, the question we've asked about some of these other guys, do you win a championship without that guy making those plays that maybe people don't remember because they didn't result in touchdowns. So that was Larry Anderson.
Yeah, probably too, like, with the offense, needed a little spark there. That definitely helped. That's, coaches always talk about hidden yardage, 162 yards, especially back in the 70s where offense wasn't as, prevalent. That's a lot of yards to give up on special teams. Another great B team guy that people will definitely remember is the Penguin defenseman Hal Gill. He was really the last of the big defensemen. He was listed at 250 pounds, 6'7". And the Pens blog who gave him a great nickname, they call him the USS Hal Gill, because he was just huge. And he was, even though he was big and oafish, he was still effective in a time when the league was changing from physical to speed. And I think, too, like the Penguins had great pairs. They would pair him up with like Gonchar or Letang or like another guy that was more of a skater. And that way, when teams would try, like the Red Wings would try that, or I don't know about the Flyers, but like teams would try and park in front of Fleury Hal Gill was pretty good at moving those guys out. And that was kind of his role. Him and Brooks Orpik, kind of like they were the physical defensemen where the other guys were the finesse defensemen. So nice piece to one of the Penguins. I think he was here for the one Stanley Cup.
He was.
Yeah.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, and he left after that season, and I remember thinking, it's not a big deal. He's just a big lumbering defenseman. We can go out and get somebody else that can be a big lumbering defenseman. And I felt like I remember the next year in the playoffs, I really felt like he was missed. Like we just did not have the same ability to stop the other team as we had the previous 2 years, and I think losing him was a big part of that.
It definitely can be argued that Hal Gill was one of those B team guys, a B team legend.
Yeah. My last guy is a little bit of a reach. It's Lee Mays. Lee Mays was a Steeler wide receiver from 2002 to 2006. Did not play a whole lot, caught 11 passes in his entire time in Pittsburgh and played largely on special teams. The reason Lee Mays is on our list is because for me personally, the fantasy football league that I'm in was in back then and still am in today. When we were drafting, this is before you would draft on Yahoo, you had to do everything manually. And we had a little egg timer, right? And so if you didn't make your pick in time, the rule was that you had to auto draft Lee Mays as your pick, as your punishment for not making the pick on time. And it became kind of a running gag. And we even, our trophy for the league championship had engraved on it. It was the Lee Mays Memorial Trophy. So Lee Mays is like one of those guys that, again, no one else would ever remember except the people in our fantasy football league. And I wanted to put him on there because I'm sure there's probably other guys like that out there that you folks listening may remember. Maybe you met that person once, or maybe you had some kind of inside joke thing about that player. But one of those guys that, again, hardly anybody else would remember. But he was the guy that we named our fantasy football trophy after. So I'll always remember good old Lee Mays.
Yeah, Lee Mays, I think he had a catch in one of the 2004 games that was big. He had against Jacksonville. I think he had a big catch, or maybe the Jets.
Yeah, there's footage. And I only remember this because I found it back then when we were always talking about Lee Mays. But there's a clip of after that Jacksonville game of, I think, Cowher in the locker room giving him the game ball because he made a big game, and he's like, he has the game ball. He's like, "Where's Lee Mays?" And he hands him the game ball. So yeah, he had one or two little moments there, but catching 11 passes in 5 seasons, probably that might have been the only one.
Yeah, and sticking with guys who are probably on this list just because of a funny incident. That's Miroslav Satan. It's really Satan, and he's never played for the New Jersey Devils, and he was a pretty mediocre right wing. But it was just always fun to say, how can you lose when you have Satan on your team? So. Good old Miroslav couldn't, help the fact that his name's really Satan, but.
And he was part of that 2009 team, so the name Satan is engraved on the Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
So there's always that.
He's got that going for him.
Well, folks,
that was a pretty fun list there, Tim. Anything else? Chris Oldham. I remember Chris Oldham. He had a couple interceptions once, but.
Yeah. I mean,
You can go
There's
through
a couple
lot of
other
bad
guys.
guys.
There's a couple other guys we could have probably put on this list. And I'm sure there's guys we forgot, and I'm sure there's guys that people used to love to root for, or just kind of remember for some maybe key moments that they contributed to one of our teams. So yeah, but that's our list. Thanks everybody for listening. Please check out our website. It's pittsburghsportsmemories.weebly.com. We're also on Twitter and Facebook. Please leave us a review and tune in next time. Thanks everybody.